Mandy, Chapter 3. Mandy shared a bedroom with one other girl. Her name was Sue. She and Mandy were close friends. The girls were almost the same age, Sue being the younger of the two by 3 months. She was not as strong a personality as Mandy, and preferred to have Mandy take the initiative in all things. This suited Mandy very well, and she happily allowed Sue to share most of her activities. There were times, of course, when this was not convenient, and Sue would sulk and feel out of sorts whenever Mandy expressed her desire to be alone, somewhat like big and little sisters. This was not easy for Mandy, for then she felt as if she were responsible for the other girls' happiness and well-being, and it lay heavily on her. But luckily, these times were few and far between, and generally the girls got on very well. They shared confidences and exchanged ideas. They even borrowed items of clothing and behaved much like two sisters who were very close. Being seniors, the girls were privileged to have a room to themselves. It was an attic bedroom and Mandy loved it. She loved being high up in the house, away from the other children. There was a small skylight in the roof just over her bed. Many nights she lay awake thinking and gazing at the distant stars in the sky above her. She found them very comforting, especially during the difficult nights when she felt troubled and disturbed. But on the evening of the day she discovered the cottage, she was happily preoccupied with the thoughts of the pretty little house and the wonderful afternoon she had had. As Mandy and Sue were preparing for bed, Ellie, the maid, appeared around the door. "Hey, Mandy, I found out something for you. You know you asked what was on the other side of the big wall?" Mandy's heart skipped a beat. She busied herself and managed to appear nonchalant. "Yes? Well, Matron says it's a big estate in there. A really big one. Only nobody lives there anymore." "Oh, thank you, Ellie. What a marvelous piece of luck. If nobody lived there, then she wouldn't be bothering a soul if she visited the cottage. It really could be hers." As she snuggled into bed and turned out the light, Mandy felt wonderfully content. "Sue?" she whispered into the darkness. "Oh, nothing. Good night." She decided that she would say nothing about the cottage just yet. Mandy lay on her back, arms behind her head, staring at the night sky winking above her. She pictured the little house, alone and silent, under the same stars. Her mind was filled with plans and ideas and lists of things to get for it. It was midnight before she fell asleep. Chapter 4. The next day was bright and sunny. Mandy could hardly wait for school to be over. It was Friday, so she had only a half day of studies and all the weekend before her. Immediately after lunch, Mandy sped to her room and put on her oldest clothes. She ran into the garden and began looking for Jake, the handyman and gardener at the orphanage. Mandy wanted to ask his advice and possibly borrow a few tools. She found him in the potting shed at the end of the kitchen garden. He was an old man and very stooped. He wore exactly the same clothes, day in and day out. Black shiny pants, a collarless shirt with the sleeves rolled up to the elbow, and a dark blue striped waistcoat. He brought his own lunch to the orphanage in a little tin box. His lunchtime drink was always 2 bottles of beer, and, predictably, he would snooze for a while in the early afternoon, propped up against the potting shed among the rakes and spades and brooms and buckets and pots of every shape and size. He knew just about all there was to know about nature. It was his religion, and he spent most of his life outdoors, rain or shine. He was just finishing his lunch when Mandy found him. "Now, Mandy, don't you come bothering me. I'm just going to take my snooze in a while." "Oh, Jake, I won't stay long. I just wanted to ask you a few questions." Well?" "Is it very difficult to weed a garden?" asked Mandy. "Do I have to know anything special?" "Bless my soul," Jake looked surprised. "Whose garden are you going to weed?" "Nobody's," said Mandy. "But is it very difficult?" "Well, it depends on your soil." Jake took a long drink from his beer bottle and wiped his lips with the back of his hand. "You see, if it's good and rich and soft, then really most of your weeding can be done by just pulling at the roots, very gently, mind you, until they sort of ease out, and then you can shake them off and throw them away. But if the earth is packed and hard, then you need a small fork or trowel, and you sort of dig it in under the weeds, lift them up gently, and kind of shake the earth loose before pulling the plant out. But anyone can do it, he added, almost as an afterthought. I see, said Mandy. Do you have a small fork I could borrow? Thought you weren't going to be doing any of that, said Jake, squinting up at Mandy in a teasing way. I sort of am. Mandy didn't want to tell Jake about her secret plans. It's a project, she added hurriedly. Well, I can't let you take my things, Jake began. Oh, I'll return them by tonight, Mandy broke in. I promise, Jake. Just try me this once, and see if I don't. By the time you get here tomorrow, it'll be back in the shed. Jake wanted his afternoon sleep, and Mandy was in a persistent mood. All right, Mandy, but you're on your honor now. I hope you can be trusted. He slowly got up and found her a small fork. It was old and had a smooth, worn handle. Oh, Jake, thank you, Mandy beamed with delight. You just bring it back. He seemed rather pleased with himself. Now, since you're borrowing that, what about a rake to smooth your garden over when the weeds are out, he added. Mandy could have hugged him. Gathering up the tools, she hurried around to the back door of the orphanage. Leaving the rake and the fork on the doorstep, she burst into the big kitchen and found Alice, the cook, just sitting down at the large wooden table to eat her own belated lunch. Alice, could I please have some bread and butter and water to take out for the afternoon? She moved quickly behind the lady and threw her arms around her shoulders in a hug. I'm going for a long walk, and I won't be back till dinner. Alice had her mouth full, but she pointed at the pantry. Bread's in there and a couple of scones, too. Help yourself. You can use one of those old ginger beer bottles for water. Mandy buttered the bread and the scones and rinsed out the bottle and filled it with fresh, cold water. You don't have any old dusters you don't want, do you? She suddenly asked. And then seeing the surprised look on the cook's face, she added, rather lamely, I thought I'd do my room later. Alice smiled. She heaved her big frame up from the table and went to the cupboard under the sink. Will this do? She held up a torn piece of muslin about the size of a kitchen towel. Ooh, yes, Mandy nodded happily. Thank you, Alice. She gathered up her food and water and her duster and slammed out of the kitchen door. Well laden, she staggered into the orchard a few moments later. The problem now was how to get all of her things over the wall. She finally decided to tie everything up in the muslin cloth and attach that to the big rake. Then she placed it in an upright position against the wall. Finding the same foothold she had used the previous day, she scrambled to the top. Leaning down, she carefully took hold of the rake and eased it safely up beside her. Then she let it down on the other side of the wall and swung herself into the apple tree. Within seconds, she was racing along the pathway, clutching her possessions, her whole being filled with anticipation and excitement at the thought of seeing the cottage once again. She burst through the trees into the clearing and stopped short. A fat rabbit disappeared quickly into the bank by the stream. A blackbird ticked and flew into the trees. She was afraid she had dreamed it all yesterday, but there it was, solid and welcoming. It was a glorious afternoon. The sun beat down, and the scent of the earth mingled with grass and clover. Mandy noticed a may tree that she hadn't seen the day before. It was in full bloom. Behind the house, there was a bank of rhododendrons, their fat buds due to open almost any day now. There was so much she wanted to do and to see. It would obviously be impossible to do all that needed to be done this afternoon. Since Jake had lent her the rake and the fork, and she had promised to return them by evening, and since the weather was so fine, she decided to attend to the garden first. The cottage could always be cleaned on a rainy day. So she set her things down by the door and surveyed the garden, her garden. The little path was obviously the first thing to be cleared. She decided to begin by the front doorstep. Kneeling down, she pulled at the long weeds. To her delight, they came out of the ground very easily. Carefully and methodically, she worked her way toward the little gate, avoiding the patch of stinging nettles. She made a mental note to try to get a pair of gardening gloves. They would really help to protect her hands on some of the rougher jobs. She discovered pale gray flagstones beneath the weeds, so she cleared out all the grass around them and in between them. It was a big improvement the moment the path was cleared. It gave her a real sense of what needed to be done next. The clean line of the flagstones directed her attention to a very pretty wild rose tree that was growing up and around the porch. It needed tying back. Mandy made another note to find some twine the following day. Next to the door, there were Michaelmas daisies, dry and dusty-looking stalks, closely growing. They were not yet in full bloom, but would be a fine splash of color by late summer. There were many shrubs and flowers that Mandy didn't recognize, but she knew some of the wildflowers and left them in the ground. She wasn't sure what to do about the weed called convolvulus. It was growing over everything, and although Mandy knew that it produced a pretty white trumpet-like flower, she decided to pull it all out, feeling that as many tendrils might choke some of the better things. She worked hard all afternoon. Her back began to ache, and her knees were scraped and dirty. She became so warm in the full sun that she removed her cardigan. She was totally engrossed in her work. Every foot of the earth that she cleared seemed to reveal some new treasure. She was fascinated by the beauty of the snails and the long worms that came to light. At one point, she discovered an anthill and watched it with wonder. The little insects were so busy and seemed to have such a sense of purpose. Mandy wished she could be part of their world for just a little while. A sparrow came and perched on the low fence and watched her with a beady eye. Wood pigeons cooed softly in the trees, where they probably had a nest. By late afternoon, Mandy had cleared a path in one whole side of the garden. Near the fence, she discovered quite a large clump of nasturtiums. They would soon be glorious colors of red, orange, yellow, and gold. Those are Winnie the Pooh's favorite flowers, by the way. Mandy wiped her brow. She was hot and thirsty. She decided to rest for a moment. Fetching her bread and scones and water, she sat on the front doorstep and contemplated her work. Now that the garden was partially cleared, it was easier to guess at its original shape and form. There must once have been a tiny lawn and flower beds under the windows and along the fence. There was a huge box hedge running around the back of the house, and a lot of privet hedges, too. They would need trimming, and the grass would need cutting. She would have to be nice to Jake, and perhaps he would lend her some more tools. She munched on her bread and drank from the ginger beer bottle. She was feeling pleased with herself. The little stream gurgled nearby, and the afternoon was lazy and quiet. This is all too wonderful. I could stay here forever, she thought. She leaned against the doorframe. Wonder what I should tackle next. The other flower beds, I suppose, especially if I buy some seeds tomorrow. I'll want to plant them. She thought of the shopping she should do. Money was going to be a problem. She had pocket money saved, and she received a little every Saturday for her work in the grocery store. So tomorrow she'd have enough money to make a start on flowers and things. She'd also need a pair of gloves and some twine for the roses. Jake could help her with that. She would need a lot of things for the inside of the cottage, too. Mandy got up and wandered indoors. She immediately noticed the old rake lying on the floor, and her breath caught with pleasure. Well, at least she had her own rake, and didn't have to borrow that from Jake. But how was she to clean the windows? Where would she find a broom and enough dusters? She went into the little kitchen and looked in the cupboard. She examined the old tin basin. As far as she could tell, it was intact. I can get water from the stream for washing up. Wish I had a little stove. It'd be fun to make tea and things. Must make a grocery list. Whew, housekeeping isn't easy. So much to remember. In the shell room, she crossed to the fireplace and looked at it carefully. On the side, there was a little trivet held by a bracket. When Mandy touched it, it swung over the fireplace. It must have been used for cooking. so she wouldn't need a stove. Now if only the fireplace would work. She would collect some wood later and try it. She decided to add pencil and paper to her list so that she could write down all the things to do and not forget them. It was getting late and time to leave for this day. Mandy wandered through the cottage, feeling the pride of ownership. She stood at her front door, looking down the newly weeded garden path. Freshly turned earth smelled wonderful. She wandered slowly to the little stream and bathed her face and hands in the clear water. It was pretty and shaded there, with green ferns growing on the banks. The water was no more than a foot or so deep. The hill beyond was solid with trees. It would be fun to follow along the stream one day to see where it went. She put the muslin duster in the kitchen cupboard, along with a ginger beer bottle. The tin basin went into the sink. She took the weeds she had pulled around to the back of the house and put them with the remains of the old bonfire. She would be making her own bonfire there soon if the rubbish kept building up at this rate. It was time to go. Gathering up Jake's tools, she headed toward the meadow and home, pausing just long enough to adjust the little white gate. Pulling it straight and setting it up neatly alongside the fence, she noted with pride that the little garden was already beginning to have a trim, care-forward look. And here is a bunny rabbit scratching his ear. Do Spots and Jumper scratch their ears like that with their little hind legs?